The History Things podcast is brought to you by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Visit trhistorical.com and use the promo code HISTORYTHINGS to receive 10% off your next purchase. Thanks for listening. Now let's start the show.
Are you ready?
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the History Things podcast. Season 3, Matty B, my co-host, the author, historian, and park ranger. You know him and you love him, Matt Borders. Welcome to the show, dude. We're here for the 3rd season. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, buddy.
I hope everything was well for you over the holidays.
Most definitely.
It's like the only time of year we don't see each other. So
True.
I hope that you had a good Christmas and Santa was nice to you. I am pumped to be back doing this for a 3rd season. Very exciting stuff we're going to get into this year. Some of the stuff you're expecting, some of the stuff you're not expecting. In fact, we're going to lead off this year with an episode you're not really expecting. We're going to go to the beach, which is something you do in January, everybody. Obviously, you know, everybody gets a little weird after the holidays, a little sad. You put the decorations away, the trees, all the other decorations. And it's actually kind of like, oh man, we're in the winter now, but at the beach, everybody feels good. So we're going to go to a place that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts. Mine personally, my dad lives down there. And, you know, it's a place that's rich and a bunch of different history, things that we've talked about on our show from time to time already, things we haven't talked about, things that are just personally geeky to us. Everybody knows I love pirates. Ooh, little hint. What are we talking about? So we're going down to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the Barrier Islands, a place known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. And to tell a story with us today is the administrator of the Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum right down there on Hatteras Island, Josh Nonnemocher. Josh, welcome to the History Things podcast. How you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely our pleasure, man. So it's really exciting to get to talk to you. I got the pleasure of meeting you over the last summer when I came down to visit my folks. And obviously I've checked out the museum before and we just connected and it was like, we got to have this chat. We got to get you in here. Right. We got to talk about all sorts of weird history stuff. You know, hanging out about beach stuff. So how did this, we'll start with a little bit about you. Like, what do you do at the museum down there? And how did you get into sort of, you know, being this really cool guy on a really small island?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but it's not a really interesting story. I moved here about 7 years ago, and I worked for the county. I worked for a realty office, and then this position at the museum opened up, and I had been a Hatteras history buff for quite some time, so I gave it a shot, and they hired me, and here I am 4 years later.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love the work that you guys do at the museum down there. So I'd be real proud of that if I were you. And thanks for being an inspiration to guys like me who just need to take chances and start applying to places in the industry. And who knows, might find my new gig.
Hey, you never know.
The museum down there, we're looking to cover a wide breadth of history. Does the museum itself cover a whole range of history?
Yes, specifically from about the Civil War through World War II for most things. Now, we do have some exhibits on piracy. Obviously, that's a little bit further back. And we do have some newer stuff like the history of underwater diving and archaeology and so on and so forth. But most of it kind of focuses on that 1860 to 1950 kind of era on the Outer Banks.
Spread.
Absolutely. Yeah. So with the... You know, I guess the date range that we're covering here, there's plenty of rabbit holes we can get down. So let's start with the simple one. You know, we build this, you know, for what it is. It's known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. So can you tell our listeners why the Outer Banks is known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic?
Well, it's because of the thousands and thousands of shipwrecks off the coast that have occurred here since basically the late 1500s. A lot of people attribute the first wreck to being the galleass Tiger, which wrecked off Ocracoke Island in 1585. So over the years, just because of weather patterns, because of piracy, because of war, and I mean, just because of human error too, and the shoaling that occurs off of our shore where the Labrador Current meets the Gulf Stream, it provides really treacherous conditions in a shipping lane that to help save sailors time. Now, obviously, that doesn't affect modern vessels as much as it did in the days of yore. But basically, if they would try to take the shipping lanes, the Gulf Stream or the Labrador, they would risk passing by Cape Hatteras and running aground. And once a ship is stranded on a sandbar, wind and waves can tear it apart pretty quickly.
So you can find some of these shipwrecks right on the beach still, right? I think last time I was down there, my stepmother, who volunteers at the museum, told me that you could find one almost directly outside the museum, just head to the beach, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We have the Ram 55 wreck right across the street, and the Flambeau wreck is about a half a mile north on the beach, and that one gets exposed periodically based on wind and weather patterns and stuff like that. There's about a 150-foot section of the hull under there. And just a shout out to Judy, by the way. She's great, and really appreciate her volunteering here. So, our volunteers are kind of the lifeblood of the museum. They kind of free us up to be able to do everything while they take care of the front desk and greet visitors and everything like that. So it's great having them.
Very cool. So I'm a big fan of a lot of things that are obvious, like the American Civil War, both the World Wars, things like that. But I'm also a huge fan of piracy. So I know that there is an exhibit at the museum on piracy. Is that something that you have a wealth of knowledge on about, how it relates to the Outer Banks, or are you to the Hatteras stuff specific?
I'm more so into the Hatteras stuff specifically. However, the exhibit that I think you're referring to is the traveling Blackbeard exhibit. Yeah. It was here while you were here, yes. And it has since moved on to the Museum of History. It's the third time that it's been through here since I started at the museum, and it showcases a lot of really great artifacts off Blackbeard's ship that I'm not legally allowed to use the name of, just because of the between the state and the archaeology firm that found it. But it also has some great, like a replica of a cage that they would publicly put people into, and all kinds of fun stuff like that.
Can we specifically call it the Vengeful Queen? Like a vengeful queen?
I suppose so, yeah, as long as it doesn't have a TM, after it. That should be fine. Yeah.
Do the math, people. Figure it out. Google Blackbeard.
That's wild, though, that there's some restrictions on the ship's name. I had not heard of that before.
It's just because it's in litigation over who owns the rights to the name. So
I see.
People ask all the time, why can't I take pictures of the piracy exhibit? And I tell them it's really not. They're like, will the flash ruin the artifacts? I'm like, no, it's really not that interesting of a story. But
yeah, it's just lawyers are doing their thing. Exactly. I wondered that the first time I was down there as well. But I obviously respect the rules. So let's get into some of the stuff at the museum, right? Or actually, wait. We almost skipped over pirates. This is like my one chance to talk about it on the show. So let's backtrack and let's get back on the rails, guys. First derailing of the season 3 came real early, guys. So piracy in the Outer Banks, did it develop in the 1500s when the first shipwrecks started because of either storms, things like that, or is that strictly the golden age, the late 18th century? I'm sorry, the early 18th century, late 17th century, things like that?
Most of what you hear about is the golden age of piracy, and that's mostly because the pirates would operate out of the barrier islands because they would ride in these small, fast sloops that would be able to navigate shallow waters where big ships wouldn't be able to follow them. So that kind of made the areas around like Hatteras Island, Ocracoke, Portsmouth Island a haven for them, just because, strategically, they could just go out, plunder a ship, and then right back into the Sound and be able to escape any big ships from pursuing them and be able to hide out.
Now, on the next island down from where you are, Ocracoke, is where Blackbeard meets his fate. Is Blackbeard the only super famous pirate to, sail the waters of the Outer Banks, or are there other big names that people are going to know?
There are other big names. Stede Bonnet is a big one. Anne Bonny, the female pirate. Right. She, obviously, there's not a whole lot of stories outside of Blackbeard that are widely known, but there are definitely some other famous pirates.
All right. So if you love pirates, make sure you check out the Outer Banks Pirate History. It's super rich. And there's a random dude on Ocracoke Island who permanently lives as a pirate cosplayer. And every time I go down there, he's just walking around, no shoes, got a pirate flag. He's just walking around. I think I've taken pictures with him for 15 straight years.
That sounds about right. You find. I was just gonna say you find some interesting careers here on Hatteras and Ocracoke, especially.
If you're the random pirate dude and you're listening to our show just by complete happenstance, please reach out. I want to know your name, and I want to get you in studio and figure out how you came to be as a pirate.
Pretty sure it's the Blackbeard Jamboree on Ocracoke this week too.
Oh man, I'm up here in Maryland. That sucks. All right, I'm quitting my job. I'm coming down. So obviously the piracy is a huge focus of the island because of Blackbeard's connections to it. But the island is rich in a lot of history, and so I don't want to dwell too much on every single pirate story. I just wanted to sort of like get into this conversation with pirates because it's easy and simple. But some of the things that we really want to talk about start with what the museum sort of starts to talk about timeline wise is around the Civil War. When you go to the Outer Banks, you're thinking, aside from the fact that it's gorgeous down there, and I can't stop thinking about that. I love being here and I hate, going home to work. Like the Outer Banks is like a magical summer vacation place, but it's also rich in things like the Wright Brothers history. The first flight takes place down there, life-saving stations, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, because I got a specific shipwreck in mind that I want to talk about.
Great.
But there's a bunch of things that come to mind that are obvious, but the American Civil War isn't really one of them. And I love that you guys have a huge section devoted to covering the American Civil War. So can you tell us a little bit about the museum's coverage of the American Civil War and sort of about the Civil War as it happened on the island?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, as soon as you walk into the museum, you're greeted by the First Order for Nell lens from the Cape Hatteras lighthouse. And that was a very important part of the Civil War history when the Confederate Army tried to defend it against the Union coming and capturing the lens to be able to use it to coordinate naval maneuvers offshore. So it was a very intricate piece of technology for its day, and the Confederates dismantled it and hid it for years, and it traveled around the state, and then it went back to France for repairs. It came back to the United States, and they sent it back down to the Outer Banks, but nobody told them it was the same lens, so everybody thought it was a different one, and they thought that the lens was lost in the Civil War and never recovered. And it actually took until 2002 before an historian named Kevin Duffus discovered in the National Archives that it was the same lens all along.
So that's a modern sort of rediscovery. That's
amazing.
Awesome.
Yeah. It took quite a few years. But we have the lens fully restored. It is obviously missing a lot of crystals. If you've ever seen pictures of it, or obviously you've seen it in person, and the center panels, but a lot of the crystals were actually returned from local families who had taken them over the years when it was exposed to the elements as souvenirs. So that was kind of a cool piece. The community here is very integral in our history. Just the sense that of the close knitness of Hatteras and of Ocracoke, and just supporting each other. So that was really great to get them back as well.
Quietly, that's one of my favorite things about the island is like you go down there and you see names like Midget, and you go down to the next island and you see Wahab and things like that, and those families are still rolling around like aplenty. There's a lot of them up here. We're around Antietam National Battlefield, and we know names like Poffenberger Farm and things like that. And like I have friends that went to high school with Poffenbergers, and like there's Poffenbergers running all over Washington County still. So it's cool.
There's a Poffenberger that works at Monocacy right now.
Is it really?
Yeah,
fantastic.
He's one of them.
Plot twist. So I think that's really cool that you like can connect with a lot of the history of the island through like the modern day people. They're still there. Like those families are still sitting on a lot of their land.
Yeah. There's a lot of fun lore too. Like the Midget family supposedly washed up from a shipwreck hundreds of years ago, clinging to barrels of distilled spirits, and they never left. So
that's a good one. I've never heard that one before.
Yeah. There's all kinds of fun stories like that. But yeah, they still have their same land holdings. Something really interesting I have, and I'd love to share this with you sometime. I have a map from 1862. A man named Farquhar out of Virginia, who was working for the government, plotted out Hatteras Village on a map, and there's all these family homesteads plotted out that are all have these same names that you see today. But I was looking at the map and I'm like, who are the Burrows family? Spelled Burrows. And I got to thinking about it, and I think that maybe Mr. Farquhar heard the name Burris pronounced wrong and wrote it out as Burrows all over the map where the Burris homesteads were. And I mean, there's shipwrecks documented on there that aren't there anymore. They probably got refloated and they're somewhere else. Fort Clark and Fort Hatteras are marked on there. The Hotel d'Afrique, the first safe haven for African Americans during the Civil War, all on this map. And it's this high definition scan. It's just beautiful.
Well, we're coming down this summer, so I'll see you in July.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. That's super cool. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? So the American Civil War, when it breaks out, one of the first things that the Confederacy does is darken their coastline. They're obviously not trying to assist in the Federal Navy outmaneuvering them because there basically isn't a Confederate Navy at this point. So when they darken the coast, I feel like we should mention, not only at Hatteras do they take the light out and abscond with it, but they just blow up the Bodie Lighthouse entirely a little bit further up on the island chains. They're like, no, we're going to hold my beer. We're just going to blow this one up, which I thought was fun because when you look at the modern Hatteras Lighthouse, that's an 1870s tower. So that's not the one that would have been there during the American Civil War. And it wasn't built as a result of the American Civil War. In fact, just as a plot twist to a plot twist, the tower that's there now, I think, was built on the recommendation of a then Lieutenant David Dixon Porter. And then during the Civil War, I think he's an admiral at that point.
He will be, yes.
Yeah. So in the 1870s, that's like a 20-year sort of like playoff. But the Bodie Lighthouse, they're like, we're just blowing this thing up outright. And so the tower you see there now is built as a direct, we have to rebuild this thing. So that's the one we see now. So I think that's cool. But so
that is really cool.
Confederacy darkens the coast. And obviously they send down one of the first, and Avery Lentz, if you're listening, this is a shot coming right across your bow. One of the first Army, Navy combined.
Yes,
it's not
indeed.
the first because it happens in the Revolution and sorts too, but it's one of the first big ones where there is a beachhead established right on Hatteras Island. Josh, just for context, Avery is a Fredericksburg historian, and obviously they do that crossing the river up there, so he's very anti this argument. But
gotcha. Yep.
So federal soldiers are landed on the island, and they're coming after basically the local Confederate presence. There's 2 forts down there. And what is the Confederate presence on the island at the time? Is it like a full massive division down there, or is it just like kind of the local home guard holding it down?
It's kind of like the local home guard, and there was a fort up at Chickamaucomico, if you've heard of the Chickamaucomico races, where, I mean, if you think about Hatteras Island, and if you're coming from the top, you got to come all the way down. And I mean, traveling that 60 miles during the Civil War was no easy task. So, I mean, they chased them all. I mean, basically the museum is the last building on the island, and we're right just a little bit to the northeast of where Fort Clark was located. So they chased them all the way down here to the museum, last building on the island. Well, it wasn't there, obviously, but and then those 2 forts are occupied. So that's when the Battle of Hatteras Inlet Batteries occurs in August of 1861. And you mentioned it was a combined operation of the Union Army and the Navy, and it ultimately resulted in the Union domination of strategically important sounds, Pamlico, Albemarle. And that gave the Union Army access to the intercoastal waterways to be able to further move into North Carolina, which was huge. I mean, at the time, it was a tremendous victory. If you think about it, for such a small little sliver of sand, it was a pretty significant turning point. So, the forts just didn't have enough power to be able to engage the bombardment from the fleet that was out there. And it was the battle itself was the first application of the naval blockading strategy. So kind of to commemorate that, we have flags on display here that are pretty large. We have one from the USS Monticello, which was part of the blockade squadron, and a flag flown by the 9th New York Infantry Regiment. There was 220 of those soldiers here during that, and we also have that on display in the museum as well.
What we like about that is that's another hometown connection to us up here. The Hawkins Wobbs, they fight, and they have a monument on Antietam National Battlefield right up here where we are. So that's pretty cool. The flag on the Monticello is massive.
It is big, yeah.
I mean, that thing is huge. Like the only flag bigger than that I've seen was the Fort McHenry flag at the American History Museum up here. But the Monticello flag, when I walked in and you kind of get on the left side where it is and you see it, you're like, holy, that's a big one. Like I wasn't expecting that. But you think about it, when they say hoist the colors so you can be seen from a ship, just off the horizon, that makes sense. They got to see who you are, or I guess, I don't know, but it's just massive. So I think it is
massive. Yeah. They're both big flags, but I mean, that one just, it's something else when you look at it.
Now, Josh, the fortifications on the islands is there anything that remains of those? And if there is there any sort of maintaining them either by the state or anything like that?
There is not. In the last maybe 15 years, I would say, the beach at Hatteras Inlet has receded considerably. It used to extend out. I mean, like in this Farquhar map that I told you about a little bit earlier, it would extend out about 3 miles almost, and it would hook around. So there was actually kind of like a makeshift port on the north side of the island, and Fort Hatteras was out on that. Was out on the end of that, on that bight. was so close it would almost look like you could swim across the inlet to Ocracoke from there.
Right.
So that's way out there. I mean, we're talking like 2.5 miles out in the Sound. Now, Fort Clark was, like I said, a little bit closer to the museum. So I've been told, I have not actually seen it myself, but supposedly you can see some support posts sticking up out of the Sound if you are on a boat or riding the ferry at low tide. And I can't confirm that or deny that, but that's what I've been told by several local people who spend a lot of time on the water.
Matt,
That's very interesting.
sounds like you're coming to the beach with me next summer.
I'm a big fort nerd, so
We're going exploring.
these were sand structures, though, weren't they?
For the most part.
Okay.
Mhm.
Very interesting. Yeah, I can see them being gone, but it would be interesting to try to find some of
I mean,
those
they're
support beams and
economical
whatnot.
and they're strong because
Darn right.
immediately comes to mind is Fort McAllister, which used to piss off the Union Navy, the river squadrons for like almost the entire war until Sherman came in from the land. But like Fort McAllister was just basically mounds of dirt that they just couldn't destroy because they would eat cannonballs. And like, what are you breaking? Dirt? Cool. Just shovel it back.
Yep.
You know, like
Exactly right.
with the sand, it's like, cool, you just ate all that solid shot and the shells go nowhere. So, but I find that it's probably a similar thing that happened in Fort McAllister when the federal forces land and the bombardments combined with it, like the home guard garrison, the ragtag team that's left behind, is just, they're just overwhelmed. So just a couple things real quick before we continue. There's two more Civil War things I really want to talk about. One was you mentioned the Chickamaucomico races, and I always like to have a little fun with the history we talk about. And I finally found the monument for that. It's a beautiful little marble thing, but like it's small enough that you'll miss it if you're driving off 12. You know, sad leaving the island thing. Yeah. Or you're excited coming onto the island. You're like, I don't have time for monuments. I need beers and sand right now. But I read it, and it basically, if you can imagine, it's like the Federals came down and fought and chased the Rebs off, and then the Rebs came back and chased the Yanks off, and then everybody kind of decided this ground isn't worth it. Like they just like nobody stays where they fought over it. I'm like, cool. What is this battle for?
Well, it's so much distance, to cover. I mean, even if you're driving that, I mean, personally, once you get to that stretch of 12, it's kind of a long haul to be able to get all the way down. So, and that's with a vehicle.
Burnside's guys in the Great Dismal Swamp up in the Virginia area before they even get down to the island. By the time they get to the island, they're like, we've seen everything.
Right.
What is this sand crap? But Hotel de Afrique is something that not a lot of people are going to be aware of. And I love that you guys have a really awesome monument out front to talk about it. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about Hotel de Afrique?
Yeah, it was the first safe haven for African Americans during the Civil War. Once the Union kind of took control, it was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and we actually have a stamp to commemorate that. The National Park Service has obviously their passport stamp program, but they also have this what's called the Civil War Network to Freedom stamp, where you go to various sites and so on and so forth. And yeah, we have one stamp to commemorate that as well. So it was basically just a really simplistic structure that provided shelter and would allow anybody staying there, passing through, to be able to help out, with any military operations or doing any work like that. And there was a couple outlying buildings as well. So a lot of people ask if there's any remnants of that, but it kind of met the same fate that Fort Clark and Fort Hatteras met, where it's in the water now. But the funny thing about it, and this is getting a little bit off topic, is just that we're still constantly finding relics from the Civil War, even now. I mean, as recently as May of 2019, I think, somebody came in and they had been out on the beach all day, drinking beers. They came in barefoot and in their swimsuits, and they were like, hey, we think we found some artillery out on the beach. So I went out to go look at it. And sure enough, it was a huge shell from the Union naval bombardment. I'd be 99% sure in saying that. And then I looked, and the thing was still alive. It still had the powder and the fuse in it. So and it was just bouncing around in the bed of their pickup truck. So I ended up having I called the fire department and I called the National Park Service, and emergency services came out, and the Park Service was like, hey, have them drive really slowly to the back of the parking lot, and we're going to take this thing off, and then we're going to rope it off, and we have to wait here, because they notified somebody from the Army or the Navy, and it was a naval bomb squad, had to come down from Hampton Roads. And they were either going to blow it up or take it with them, and they took it with them. So I talked to the ranger. They had to wait there like 6 or 7 hours for them to come down. I talked to the ranger. I said, hey, what happened to the cannonball? And she said, they took it with them. So I called. all the various naval bases up there. I was calling around asking this question, like explaining, hey, who I am, what I'm looking for. I would love to have this thing, for our collection if it was deactivated. And ultimately I finally got to somebody's desk and they were like, the outcome is classified and I can't give you any further information. So it's kind of ran into a brick wall.
UFO? It's not actually a cannonball. There's a small little gray alien inside of it.
Your tax dollars at work, right?
We had a similar instance up here at Matt's top secret day job. Was that a few years back now, right?
Yeah, it was a few years
But somebody walked in with like a live shell and was like, I think this is live. And everybody was like, holy. And they had to bring the Frederick County, was it PD or bomb squad came in? Or?
State troopers first, and then they had to call the bomb squad, who then took the round. It was a 10-pound Parrott rifle, case shot round. They took it out into the field, buried it, put a plug of C4 in the nose, and blew the round. Jeez. Now, our staff, what's very interesting to me, Josh, is that they didn't tell you anything about it and won't tell you anything about it, because our staff archaeologist then went out and excavated the round out of that hole, and we now use that for part of our education artifacts.
Really?
Yeah. So,
well, I wish I would have had a similar outcome.
Yeah, it's very interesting that they're being so hush-hush about it. I'm not surprised if they had to blow the round. That seems to be pretty par for the course with these, but it's still surprising that they couldn't tell you anything about it, even if it's, hey, we blew it and it's been disposed of. That's very interesting.
All right. Appeal to our listeners out there. Let's start the movement. Freedom of Information Act requests. Hashtag what happened to the round? Graveyard of the Atlantic. Let's find it out, guys.
We're going to FOIA.
Yeah, we're going to FOIA the crap out of the Department of Defense. Tell us what happened. I want to know, General Milley. Let me know.
It was a big one, too. It was probably like a 33-pound shell. It was huge.
That is a big one.
Like an anti-fort gun.
Yeah, that's what it was. That's what it was, yeah. But they're still finding them. We have a guy who does lectures here. His name is Mark Speece, and I know he just recently found one Soundside in kind of the same area. So they're out there. You never know what's under the sand here.
That's so cool. Like, and that's because obviously the island moves. Essentially, it's an organic thing. Like, it's shifting at all times. And I learned this as a young kid because the first time we went down there was these massive beaches. In the same area that I would go to now, the beaches are significantly smaller. Mm-hmm. They went from being like 180 yards to like 80 yards. So we lost like 100 yards of beach over the last 20 years.
Yeah. And
I was going to say, it sounds like a movie tagline, though, what you said there, Josh, with you never know what's in the sand. That's great.
Good marketing.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, I myself have found all kinds of fishing tackle that I've used, that we put to practical use. I found
some fishing tackle this summer in my foot. I was very excited about that. That was a very fun 30 minutes on the beach getting that out.
I remember you telling me that. Josh, when does Hotel d'Afrique actually begin?
Well, it's basically right after the Battle of Hatteras Inlet. By maybe like 1862, there was probably about 40 fugitive families living there, all just fleeing and looking for safety.
Okay. Now, are these families and eventually the other folks that are fleeing here are they part of the groups that we hear about for when like the New England teachers and things start coming down and they're establishing freedmen colonies and stuff along the coast and trying to educate folks and basically get them to a point where they can move beyond having been enslaved?
Yeah, well, that's more so in the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony, I think is kind of what you're talking about. This was more of just a kind of a stop along the way where they would have, a safe place to stay for a small amount of time. The original inhabitants of Hotel d'Afrique were the black gun crew of USS Minnesota, which played a role in the victory. So then kind of became this stop of people who were moving to places to pick up various jobs like watermen. That was usually a big trade down here, just being out, fishing or being on the water, just anything that related to the water. They would have a stop here. But the Freedmen's Colony on Roanoke Island was kind of the bigger settlement that you're talking about.
Okay, very good.
Was there a large enslaved individual population on the island?
Not that you really hear about. There were some, and again, it was more so a Roanoke Island thing because they had a much larger community up there. But I mean, Etheridge, the first black U.S. life-saving station keeper. He was originally born. He was born into slavery before fighting for the Union Army, before then working for the U.S. Life-Saving Service, and then being promoted to keeper and establishing the first all-black life-saving crew at Pea Island Life Saving Station.
That's awesome.
Awesome. One of my favorite shipwrecks of the Civil War can be found right there at the Pea Island. I think stop. Is that it's the refuge stop up there? I think, right? Am I wrong? Where?
The visitor center where the smokestack's sticking up out of the water.
Yeah, I think that's the USS or the SS Oriental. Is the ship that's out there? Yeah. SS Oriental.
Correct.
So
awesome.
There's a couple Civil War shipwrecks right there.
And the new bridge. There was the Lego bridge, the makeshift bridge that formed. I believe it was. Hurricane Irene, I want to say, is when the new inlet formed north of Pea Island, and that new bridge that they just finished in 2017 or 2018. That's the Richard Etheridge Bridge, named in his honor. There's also a U.S. Coast Guard cutter named after him too.
All right, that's pretty awesome. Before we get away from the American Civil War,
we have one more Civil War topic to talk about.
Okay, good.
I almost forgot it, but it's a big one.
Okay, good.
I'll do my best.
Do we see the, and again, this may be myself confusing this with Roanoke, and I apologize for that, but do we see the Freedmen's Bureau operating in this area, late Civil War, into the opening years of Reconstruction?
Not so much on Hatteras Island, but yes, Roanoke, yes, absolutely. Okay. And we have a great video on our website kind of about the era of Reconstruction for the Black experience after the Civil War. You can find that in the video section in the education page at graveyardoftheatlantic.com. So if you wanted some further information on that without me kind of going into it in depth, that's a good resource.
Great. Yeah. Plug those sources, because we want to give you guys as much love as possible.
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. Hey, follow us on Facebook, Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, Instagram, Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, and visit us at graveyardoftheatlantic.com.
Go to the island. Go to the museum. Take a trip. You've all been working your asses off for the last couple of years. You deserve a vacation. Go.
Sure. I will say that our visitation as of since we reopened on September 14th, 2020, has been just beyond any kind of numbers that we ever could have expected. I think since January, we've served well over 100,000 visitors since January of this year. Yeah.
That is impressive.
Pretty tremendous. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. So the big Civil War thing to talk about on the island is actually not on the island. It's about 17 miles off the coast of the island and way underwater.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Yes, you do. Yes, you know. You guys have a great display in the museum about it. So I'm talking about the USS Monitor, obviously.
Yes.
The famed ironclad of the American Civil War meets its watery grave in the graveyard of the Atlantic. Can you tell us a little bit about the USS Monitor's experience, just briefly in the war, but mostly how it meets its end right off the coast of the island there?
Sure. I mean, I guess everybody pretty much knows the most famous battle would be the Monitor and the Merrimack. Now that was in the Hampton Roads area, but it was the first ironclad commissioned by the U.S. Navy, and the revolving turret, which was designed by Theodore Timby, was often replicated in future designs of ships for many years. It was not made for high seas travel. I think was ultimately the problem. And what's interesting is we wouldn't be here without the Monitor. The museum itself was actually built because they were looking for a place to house artifacts for USS Monitor. This is, I believe, in the mid 80s. And there was no place on Hatteras Island to be able to do it. So they tried to establish a museum at what is now a county building in Buxton. It's actually, they use it for like voting sometimes and so on and so forth. It's by the old PNC Bank. And that wasn't an adequate facility. So all of the artifacts that they wanted to give went to the Mariners Museum instead. So a committee kind of got together and they were like, hey, we could really use this museum on the island. They established a group to try and start fundraising and garnering public interest. There was a lot of people who were involved. I mean, in the Midget family, Danny Couch, the Burruss family, Virgil and Belinda Willis, they owned Lee Robinson's General Store, if you're familiar with that. They were instrumental in getting this museum built. And for the site, the other outlying buildings that never really came to fruition, but the ground itself is raised up about 12 or 13 feet above sea level, which is pretty high for the island, especially for this part of the island. And then they designed this building to basically be well, I'm not going to say hurricane proof, but hurricane resistant. So, the building itself is designed to withstand gusts of wind up to 250 miles an hour and sustained gusts of 135. There's hurricane grade windows and doors. The collection storage facility has a high density shelving. It's got a vapor barrier and it's temperature and oxygen controlled. There's a huge drainage dish. There's some pumps that run under the building. There's a huge generator that can run the whole building for about a week. So even with the intermittent power outages here on Hatteras Island, we're still open. And so ultimately it all kind of came together. And although we only got a few artifacts from the monitor to put on display here, and we have a nice case. We have a replica of the turret. You can watch a video, see a model of the ship. It ended up becoming a whole other entity altogether, just kind of representing and presenting the coastal culture and the shipwreck history and the local culture of the Outer Banks and Hatteras Island specifically.
So real quick, I just want to provide some context for our listeners when we're talking about like what the building can withstand, because you actually got to it before I could ask you. I was going to ask you about the design of the building itself, because it's obviously really unique to part of its story is that it's, designed to be this sort of behemoth in the storm down there. So just for context for our listeners, John said it could handle like 250 mile an hour winds, sustained winds of like 135 miles an hour. That's a category 4, right? So that is a absolute S kicker. The kind of thing that just happened down, I believe, is in New Orleans, down around Louisiana and stuff like that. But just for context for the Outer Banks, the big one that everybody has in recent memory that like was real bad was Isabel, and that was in 2002, and that came ashore as a 2, I believe. And a category 2 is 96 to 110 mile an hour winds. So the museum down there can take a punch right in the face is basically what I'm saying, and it can handle it. So in the really cool
event of a zombie apocalypse, I'm glad I had the key to this place.
That's you're on an island too, so plus there.
It's funny you mentioned Hurricane Isabel because that was right after the museum was finished. We opened in 2002. Not all the sections of the museum opened, but the principal room opened, and I was doing research for a post one time, and I was watching helicopter footage after Hurricane Isabel while they were panning over the village, and it just looked like a bomb went off. I mean, it destroyed the General Mitchell Hotel, the old sandbar and grill. They wiped the whole restaurant out, and the apartments up above were just left on the pilings. There was an old beach box that my dad and I used to stay in as a kid, right when you get into the village, called the Star of the Sea, and it was just out in the middle of the Sound, plates floating around. I mean, it was just a devastating scene. And as the camera's kind of panning over, it gets to the museum, and it's just like there was nothing happened. Like it was almost like in a cartoon, like when something's so pristine that it gets that little ding, and it comes off of it. That's what the museum looked like. And it's just unbelievable to think that kind of force came through and just this building was unaffected, but it's anchored, 10 feet underground on concrete footings. All of those almost look like ship's timbers on the outside. Those are all anchored down. The roofing, the duraplanking on the outside, it's just all meant to withstand the elements. And there's been times when waves have come right up over the dunes and crashed into the building, and everything's been fine. It drains like it's supposed to, and the collections are unaffected. So pretty incredible.
That is the low-key most scary thought for me, is like every time I'm on the island, I always have this moment, and it comes to like when I'm not expecting it, where I realize I'm like, we are out in the ocean. Like if the tidal wave, like I watch a lot of cheesy movies. Deep Impact obviously is another thing that connects to the Outer Banks, because that's where Tay Leone and her dad go out watching the 3,000-foot tidal wave. But
I remember that
down there, and especially when I'm coming across the bridge, because I think the house is like right there or whatever. But I keep thinking about it when you say things like the waves are coming right across. Like I have a very personal visual of that place. Like I've been there, I can't even count how many times I've been there. I've been going down there with my family since I was a real young kid. And just to think that Mother Nature can throw water up that close to that building, that is terrifying.
What you really got to worry about is storm surge coming from the Sound. That is incredible. I mean, especially at some of the vulnerable parts of the Hatteras Village, like right around Rocco's Pizza there. I mean, you'll see, and there will be 6 feet of water on the street. Like it's just absolutely unreal, the kind of devastation that can cause. But
speaking of Judy lost a car in one of the last hurricanes down there because of the storm surge from the Sound that flowed in. It totaled her car because it.
Oh no, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was a few years back. I think it was Matthew maybe that did it.
Mm-hmm. That was a bad one.
Yeah, a lot of flooding up where they were. So, all right, so let's move out of the Civil War. Let's just briefly do a quick timeline. The big Hatteras Lighthouse that everybody is super, super familiar with, the big black and white spiral tower, which was moved in a logistic feat of just amazingness in the 1999-2000 era. But that tower is built in, I think, 1870 or 1872. Which year, Josh?
1870. It was the 150th anniversary of the lighting last year. So,
right on.
So that's built in 1870. So what we're going to do is, like, if you want a history on the lighthouse, we strongly recommend, as always, go to the museum, go to the island down there, learn from the people down there. But we're going to jump ahead sort of to the turn of the century. We obviously have a lot of shipwrecks. There's a lot of rabbit holes we can get stuck in between there, but we wanted to focus on some things that relate to the show. So in the early 19th century, we have the golden age of transatlantic ocean travel beginning.
Late 19th century.
What did I say?
You said early 19th.
Did I say early 19th century? Yeah. Look, man.
You meant early 20th. I know what you meant.
Season 2 was long. We went to the Western Front to close that one out. I'm still shaking that one off. We were at Verdun talking about like this French regiment for 8 hours, basically. It was amazing, but it was a ton. So I guess I'm a little foggy still. But anyway, in the late 19th century, it's beginning. And when the century turns over into the 20th, we get the real familiar era that we know with ships named like Lusitania and Titanic, Aquitania, Olympic, and all that stuff. So let's focus on the RMS Titanic for a moment, because when you talk about Titanic, the Outer Banks immediately comes to mind, right? All of our listeners? Crickets, because it doesn't. And that was one of my favorite parts about the museum. When I went there for the first time, I was completely blown away that you guys have a Titanic exhibit in the museum. So can you tell our listeners how the Outer Banks of North Carolina connects to one of the worst maritime disasters in history in the North Atlantic Sea?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I get this question a lot because everybody's like, well, that's a bit of a stretch, don't you think? Like having a Titanic exhibit in an Outer Banks museum, but it's really not. So basically, there's a U.S. Weather Service station in Hatteras Village. It's kind of famous. It was built like at the turn of the 20th century, just about. And it was the U.S. Weather Service. They would use it to monitor storms and weather conditions, blah, blah, blah. So in 1912, there were wireless operators working in the Cape Hatteras weather station, Richard Daly and Horace Gaskins. And on April 14th, 1912, at 11:25 p.m. Hatteras time, they received a CQD message from the Titanic that may very well have been the first CQD message received on the mainland United States. So they wrote it down. It said CQD have struck iceberg from the RMS Titanic. So Daly and Gaskins forwarded this message up to their headquarters, the New York station, and it was received by David Sarnoff, who would later become the president of RCA. And he was 21 years old at the time. And Sarnoff told them that he knew that the Titanic was unsinkable, so he reprimanded them, thinking it was a hoax, and he said that they were troublemakers who were clogging up the lines and took no further action in trying to investigate the matter. And so Titanic, obviously we know the fate of Titanic, and who knows if yeah, exactly. And who knows, what could have been different or what could have played out differently had they taken them seriously. But basically, it was common practice at the time to take the old junk messages and put them in the walls for insulation. So the National Park Service obviously was not, monitoring and maintaining the site at that point. So when the Park Service took over, they went to remodel the building to have it look like it's turn of the century sort of like phase, I guess. And they were ripping these walls out, and lo and behold, came across the CQD message from the Titanic and heard the story. And apparently Daly and Gaskins kind of went to their graves with that still on their conscience. Consciences, I don't know. But yes, apparently,
let's just say that. It's weird.
It's like wanchies, conchi.
Well, they certainly did everything they could have, though, in the position they were in.
They could. I think it was just kind of the notoriety of the incident. It really weighed heavily on them, and it was for some they took to their graves with them. So very interesting story. And again, who knows? What could have played out differently. But that message is on display here at the museum.
I loved that made it all the way down there. It just shows you the power of technology and nature combined, because obviously that frequency is bouncing across the most perfect of conditions across the ocean and things like that, because that is a long way for a radio message to travel that quickly.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's the same thing. Reginald Fessenden transmitted the first musical notes from Buxton up to Manio. So, I mean, same kind of principle.
That's fantastic. I think Fessenden did some things that are local. So, like, my family has some roots in weird places, and I think there's something that he does up in a place called Cobb Island, Maryland, close to where one of my grandparents lived. So, lots of cool history like that. So, all right. So, you're not expecting a Titanic story when you come down there, but you guys deliver a really cool one, and you have some cool artifacts. You obviously have the telegram down there, but you have some things like I didn't even realize that there was like Titanic board games, which is kind of macabre in a way.
Yeah, quite.
And I think literally the point of that game was like, get off the ship. It's like, wow, like we're like, yeah, exactly. Like when you read it, you're like, wow, no chill.
There's a huge cult interest in the disaster, and I think that's all part of it. I mean, I myself used to play this computer game in the 90s. It was called Titanic Adventure Out of Time. And it was just a super fun game where you were a secret agent. I guess it would have been during World War I. And basically, if you completed the mission, you changed all the outcomes of these historical events, like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand never occurred, and you discover a painting, and it's actually by Hitler, and he becomes an artist instead of. It's really good. So anyway,
I played that game.
Have you really?
Yeah, the graphics were, for its time, really top notch. They were really touting that they had done a good job trying to do the interior of the ship and everything else. But yeah, and there was I remember that game.
You do like first person conversations with people, and they actually looked real. It was pretty crazy. Well, that's funny. That's an obscure game. So good to know I'm in good company.
Oh yeah. Our associate producer here behind the scenes is a Titanic aficionado. In fact, to the point where he was, before he joined the staff of the show, he was actually our Q3 guest in season 1 when we covered the history of the White Star Line as a whole. And and we did touch on this for a little bit in there. So it was really cool to sort of fill that out. And the museum obviously was instrumental in helping us sort of connect some of the dots and like help tell part of that story. Cause it was just kind of unreal to me that like, while all hell is breaking loose in the middle of like this cold area, this terrible, combination of ocean currents, kind of like you guys have down there with the Labrador and Gulf Streams. There's just, people down there in the Outer Banks are like, we hear you.
Yeah. It is. It's wild. There was a lot going on during all of history where, Hatteras Island kind of knew what was going on and a lot of other people didn't, but anyway, I digress. We'll get to that eventually, I think.
Yeah. So moving ahead, just only a few short years, the First World War breaks out and the transatlantic, golden era is a major part of that. A lot of these ships are requisitioned by both sides, the Central Powers and the Entente, things like that. So, you're using sister ships to Titanic, like Olympic as troop ships and Britannic. In fact, Britannic meets a fate similar to, her sister Titanic. She's at the bottom of the ocean right now. In fact, I think you can scuba dive down to that as an expert diver now. I think
she's in the Mediterranean. So,
and I think it's a blue water
shallower. Yeah, it's a lot shallower.
So you can see it. But down there, let's combine some things. Let's combine the First World War, because we are huge First World War geeks. We talk about it as often as we can. Let's combine big shipwrecks, because we love big shipwrecks in certain contexts. And let's combine some of the local families down there. Let's talk about the Jeanette family. Let's talk about the wreck of the Merla, which is another great display you guys have in the museum. 1918, when the Merla is torpedoed?
Yep, August of 1918. It was the most awarded maritime rescue in U.S. life-saving service history, and they've seen some doozies, so that's really saying something. But it was Captain John Allen Midget was the keeper, and his crew of mighty midgets, because everyone was related to him except for one person. So. But
I'm not from the island. Let's just be clear. I got the name wrong. All right, out there, everybody on the island who's listening. What an asshole!
I didn't even notice that. I thought we were going to be talking about the Jeanettes in terms of the lighthouse, but that's fine.
So yes, but my brain got stuck and like associated them right here. The wires touched in the wrong place.
There's the midgets, Jeanettes, Burris's, Scarboroughs
still there.
Yes, there are. And so
we're talking midgets. We're talking not like midgets. We're talking the midget family, and we're talking the Merla.
Yep, correct. And it was it was in August of 1918, and the crew at Chickamaucomico Life Saving Station, who were affectionately known as the Mighty Midgets of Chickamaucomico because they were pretty much all related to John Allen, they saw a huge explosion offshore, and it was the tanker Merlot transporting fuel, the British tanker, and so the explosion was extremely violent, and because fuel was leaking all over the water, it was actually catching fire. So the water was literally burning. And these men launched their surf boat, number 1046, which is on display at Chickamaucomico Life Saving Station. Excellent collection there, by the way. Really recommend visiting. They launched Surfboat 1046. I think it took them 4 times to get past the breakers. So once they launched this boat, they're motoring out, sputtering out, because it was one of those old-timey sort of motorboats. And they get to the flames, and all they could do was just take off clothing, douse it in water, and put it over their faces. And they're fanning the flames with their oars while the motor's like kind of moving them out towards it. So there was 52 crew members on board, and one lifeboat containing 9 men launched from the ship and drifted off into smoke and fire, and they were never seen again. But yeah, so they were, they were lost. But John Allen Midget and his crew managed to rescue the remaining 42 crew members on board the ship. Just that one life-saving crew, bring them all ashore, and they gave them shelter and tended to their wounds and saved 42 of these guys. So
how many trips was that, Josh?
You know what? I don't actually know off the top of my head. They were towing lifeboats too, so there were crew members who were getting on all at one time. I do not actually know how many trips it actually took, but I would imagine that they probably would have tried to do it as quickly as possible because there wasn't too much time. But so they get these guys all back to shore, and for their bravery, everyone was awarded gold life-saving medals of honor, which is the highest award that you can receive in the U.S. Life-Saving Service. And they were also awarded, crosses from the British government. And then the British Board of Trade actually gave John Allen Midget a silver cup to commemorate the rescue. And we have medals on display, and the Midget family actually loaned us the silver cup for a period of time, and they actually just took it back recently because they use it in their family baptism services.
Oh, so cool.
when they actually brought the cup to the museum to loan to us, there were 4 generations of John Allen Midget's descendants all there who had all been baptized with the cup, and they all presented it to us. So now, if all goes well, there might even be a 5th generation for the next ceremony. So we're really looking forward to that.
Very, very cool. I wonder, did the life-saving boat or the surf boat that they went out with, did it have one of those Lyle guns on it?
I don't think that they had a Lyle gun on board the surf boat because there wouldn't have been a use for it. A lot of times they would use that from shore.
Oh, really? Okay.
You familiar with what that is, Matt?
It's the harpoon.
It's like the grappling hook cannon that they had to grab things. It's a multi-tool. You can do a lot of things with it. Repel pirates, for one.
It's actually, and this is, just another shout out to Chickamaucomico Life Saving Station. Every Thursday during the season, they do a full beach apparatus drill reenactment. It's the only one that's done in the United States. They have everybody come out dressed in period clothing as U.S. Life Saving Service station members, and then they have the keeper dressed in the keeper's uniform. They wheel out the surf boat, pull out the Lyle gun, fire it out over a mast that they have constructed on the dunes, hook it up, and then they actually have little kids get in the basket and ride down the zip line. They're coming back.
That's really cool.
It is really, really neat.
Are they dressed in like late 19th century clothing, or are they dressed in like the World War I era stuff?
It's sort of the same. It's sort of the same type of uniform. I would say like turn of the century, early 1900s. The surfmen are all dressed in like an all white uniform with kind of like a sailor's hat, and then the keeper's got the vest and the watch and the little round glasses and the hat. It's pretty cool.
So all these guys that we're talking about are just so you know, are part of the forerunner stuff to what becomes the U.S. Coast Guard that we have today. So that's really cool. So the Outer Banks doesn't just get a front row seat to the First World War. Obviously, we just talked about the fact that, German submarines had torpedoed a transport ship that, obviously a British ship, shipping fuel and things like that. But they get a front row seat to the Second War as well, which is, I think, pretty unique because when Americans think about warfare, they haven't seen it with their eyes on this soil because it hasn't really happened since the Indian Wars of the 1870s, things like that. When we went to fight in Cuba and things like that, that was where it was offshore, it was off our continent. And then we went to the First World War, which is over in Europe, and everything we've done pretty much since then has been a foreign war. So standing on American soil, watching these things is a pretty unique experience to only a few places along the Atlantic coastline and Pacific coastline. Sorry,
Sure.
We can't leave out the Pacific coastline. God. But I do think that's pretty unique. You mentioned that they saw the explosion, the crew and all that stuff, but there were, civilians that were standing on the beach. I met an old guy down there once. I wish I remembered his name, who said he was, as a kid, watched explosions just happen during the Second World War. They would just watch random ships get hit. That's something that's pretty crazy. So you guys, do you cover a lot of the Second War down there in the museum as well, or just the Merlot story?
We do have we have a lot of artifacts from World War II that are not currently on display. We are the only state museum that does not have permanent exhibits right now. However, we are slated to receive funding for that in the governor's budget this year, so long as we're not overlooked. And we have an entire permanent display plan in the architect's office in Raleigh, ready to go, and as soon as we can procure the funding. So in our collection storage room, which if you come to the museum, you can see it in a huge window where we keep all of our artifacts, and we cycle artifacts into this window so you can see stuff that's not usually on display to the public. That houses a tremendous amount of stuff that's going to be incorporated in, including a large World War II exhibit. About 2 years ago, we had an engineering intern through here, and she actually designed a module that's going to allow you to sit down and understand the inner workings of a four-rotor Enigma machine like we have on display here, how it works, and then you can decode actual war messages, or you can transmit your own messages to somebody else and have them decode them. So it's going to be a pretty cool display, and that's going to be a part of it. So we're really excited about some of the prospects. But right now, like I said, we do have the Enigma machine from the U-85. That was the first U-boat sunk in the Allied U-boat campaign off of our coast, and the keyboard is in restoration. We have it in restoration alongside a couple of other artifacts off the U-85, like an escape lung and stuff like that. And then we have models of the ships that were sunk or ships that sank, U-boats as well. And a couple of other things, but our World War II exhibits are limited until our permanent exhibits are going to be installed. So.
Very cool. I actually forgot something from the First World War, Matt, and you might be annoyed at me for this because this is sort of something right in your wheelhouse. Matt is a big fan of the air war during the First World War, and this isn't related to the First World War directly, but one of the big names for the Americans in the First World War, especially in the air war, is Billy Mitchell. And between the World Wars, Billy Mitchell comes to the island to do some work. And you guys talk about that a little bit. Can you tell us, listeners a little bit about Billy Mitchell coming down to the island and being an innovator as well as politely a thorn in the side of his command staff?
That's very true.
Yeah, they were not really pleased with him at all times. He was a controversial figure, but a very intelligent man. And Billy Mitchell's experience in World War I convinced him that the future of warfare was in aviation, and he essentially is the guy who went to bat to say, a plane can sink a ship really easily. And, these big battleships are almost rendered obsolete by dropping bombs from planes. And so he conducted a series of strategic bombings all along the coast, but some off of Cape Hatteras, where he sunk the USS Virginia and USS New Jersey, and kind of proved this theory that these small aircraft could sink big ships. And
Navy was pissed.
I'm sure they were furious.
Yes, they were.
You know what else he sunk, I believe? Connecting it back to the story we just told about the Merlot, I believe we got as reparations for that war the U-boat that sunk the Merlot, correct?
You know what? I've never heard that before. But
I think we got it as reparations, and I think Billy Mitchell put it at the bottom of the ocean.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So, but I mean, just, things coming full circle. I think that it sunk a ship off the coast of the island. I think it's currently resting somewhere off the coast of the island right now. As an aviation win, though, as far as, us advancing what we could do with the burgeoning air forces of our country at the time. So I think
what's funny. Cool. What's funny about shipwrecks in general is just how they just connect to local, national, and global events and kind of put things in context. They connect you to people and places, and it's like the USS Home that sunk off Hatteras in 1837. It was basically the catalyst that created that prompted Congress to create the law that every vessel would need to carry one life vest per person, because like 90 people died and there were only 2 life vests on board. So, as early as 1837, these shipwrecks here off the Outer Banks are creating a significant, rift that kind of spreads outward to everybody. So it's pretty incredible.
Through great tragedy comes progress. We discussed that in our White Star episode with the safety of life at sea sort of stuff that happened, the mandating of actual appropriate amounts of lifeboats and life vests and things like that. So, we live pretty close to Gettysburg Battlefield, and during the First World War, they were using Pickett's Charges area as a tank camp at one point, but they were also doing bombing runs up there too. So I've always wondered if that connected to Billy Mitchell's program, or if that was just after Billy Mitchell kind of got fired.
Right. Well, that would have been before 33. 1933, the National Military Parks are converted over to National Park Service. Right. They've been run by the War Department up until that point. So War Department can do a little bit more with the battlefield landscapes than the National Park Service can. And as
Let's
Pat
drop bombs on it.
Right. As Pat was saying, they had actually chalked out the outline of a battleship on pretty much the Pickett's Charge field, and we're dropping dummy ordnance on that.
That's cool. So, but I love that connects to the Outer Banks as well. And you don't really think about that when you're down there, you're focused on the fact that it is a perfect summer most of the time you're down there. And like all of this stuff that we're talking about surrounds you at all times. So, that's why we wanted to do this now, so you can get it in your mind. So when you're getting excited to go down on your vacations this summer, you can do a little bit more than just, spend money at Wings. Don't spend your money actually spend your money at Wings, but do whatever you want. But it's just, I think the island is so much richer than just its beauty. It's everywhere. So I think it's cool. So you get First World War, you get Second World War. Obviously, submarine warfare is very prevalent in both of those wars.
65 U-boats off our shore. That's why it was called Torpedo Junction during the World War II era.
I didn't know that.
Wow. I did not know that.
86 Allied vessels, I believe, were sunk during World War II.
There are some Commonwealth graves on the island and the island below, so that's something else that connects to the Second World War, I believe. Up there, there are 2 British cemeteries on the Outer Banks, and I believe one of them is right on Hatteras Island.
Yep, and one is in Buxton, and one is on Ocracoke. We have every May except. No, it's just one on Buxton, one on Ocracoke. There's only 2. Right. Yep, you were right. And we have a British war grave ceremony every May, except for the last 2 Mays because of complications because of COVID. Sure. But basically, it's just to honor these sailors who lost their lives. The first British war grave ceremony is always held for MV San Delfino, sunk by U-203 at Pea Island on April 9th, 1942. And the Ocracoke Cemetery ceremony is the following day, and that's to honor HMT Bedfordshire, sunk by U-558 off Cape Lookout on May 11th, 1942. And so we have, we invite, just a tremendous amount of people. There's veterans that come, the British Naval Attaché comes, various high-ranking officers, the Coast Guard comes, they do a 21-gun salute. We have the Coast Guard Auxiliary Pipe Band comes, and they kind of do a tribute and do a couple pieces. They play, taps, and we always have a student read the Roll of Honor of all the names, ranks, and ages of all of the sailors that died on the ship. So, and there's 2 small pieces of British soil right here on Hatteras and right on Ocracoke. So pretty cool.
Perpetual leases, I believe. So I think that's pretty cool.
That's beautiful.
Go visit England without bringing your passports. Just don't actually step on it, because those are Helen Graves guys.
Right. Josh, because I didn't realize, I knew that there was a lot of U-boat activity off the coast. I didn't realize it was that thick. With all of those vessels being out there, do we see things happening such as the civilian watches on the beaches and that sort of thing? Do we have any sort of seacoast defenses being established? Around Charleston Harbor and things like that, there's a lot of that with minefields and the guns being established on Old Fort Sumter and Moultrie and things of that nature. Do you have anything like that occurring?
Yeah, there was a lot of civilian participation because they were, a majority of the people who were here were just, local residents. But the Coast Guard had set up several stations kind of up and down the coast, and they would actually have the name is escaping me. I think it's called like sand stompers or sand trotters or something. They were patrols on horseback to try and keep things quiet and keep things dark. And local residents would report the stuff that they would see, like if they would see a U-boat sighting or see an explosion or see debris in the water, anything that could indicate a shipwreck, they would be reporting that back to the military. And there was blackouts all up and down the Outer Banks all the time. I hear a lot of stories of people saying that they just had to turn all the lights out at dark, and they wouldn't be able to turn them back on until daybreak, and they would just hear these explosions or hear like gunfire. It's just amazing how close to home the war actually hit without people knowing or realizing. They were right offshore.
They were observing blackouts during the Second World War there, weren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That must have been, in a weird way, so eerily beautiful with the lack of light pollution.
Oh yeah,
being that far off the mainland U.S., you could have.
You think about how bright the stars are here without blackouts. It must have been like a different world. Yeah,
unreal. So I don't want to give a lesson on the Second World War. I just want to sort of touch on some of these things because we're big on connecting people to things that they are familiar with. And obviously, the Second World War, we get a ton of that in pop culture, things like that. So just, if you go down there, just know that there's a bunch of Second World War history in addition to the First World War, in addition to Titanic, in addition to Civil War, pirates, lost colonies, all sorts of things like that. The Native American history down there is extremely rich. You've heard names like Chickamauga and stuff like that. These are all local, local flavor. What am I looking for in that? What's the word I'm looking for to say? Local ties?
Ties works, flavor works.
Yeah. It's going to be a long season 3, everybody. So Josh, before we get out of here tonight, there's been a lot of stuff we talked about. Is there anything that we left out that you feel is important when people are coming down to the museum, either for the first time or they're coming back? Is there anything that you want them to focus on or something you hope they take away, when they come down to the island or to the museum itself?
I really think that just the human connection is the big thing. It's the stories of people who were resilient. It's the story of people who had to rely on each other to live. I think that that's a huge thing that's overlooked about the sailing culture, especially, in the era of the 4 or 5 masted schooner. Somebody ties a knot wrong, you don't know what could happen. So I think that, just the connection to that, the artifacts that we have off of the shipwrecks, the things people use. We have, a old Singer sewing machine off a shipwreck. We have the captain's desk of the Carroll A. Deering, a flask that somebody used, the water basin off the ship itself. If you're not familiar with the Carroll A. Deering, it was one of the most strange maritime mysteries of the 20th century. In 1921, it was a 5-masted schooner that just ran aground. And when the life-saving service finally got there 4 days later, nobody was on board. So all the lifeboats were gone. The anchors were gone. The galley was set for a meal. And there's a lot of theories that went into it. The FBI was involved. A lot of government agencies were involved. And nobody has any idea what happened to them to this day. And we have some artifacts off of the ship because salvaging was a huge part of being an island resident, especially, when resources were limited. And so the water basin and the captain's desk, we got them from the Odin family, and they had just had them since 1921. I think that Jane Odin had the water basin off the ship sitting as a planter in her house, and we didn't even need to put it through restoration because it had never been deteriorated because they had taken such good care of it since 1921. So just incredible stories of stuff that,
Let's speculate for a minute. What do you think happened to the?
Well, there's a couple different theories. Some people think maybe piracy. The biggest theory is mutiny. There was a replacement captain. Basically, the ship was traveling from Rio de Janeiro back to Hampton Roads, and there was a replacement captain on this final voyage. So they were spotted by the Cape Lookout lightship, and there was something off-putting to the crew of the lightship about the crew that was on deck. They couldn't see the captain. It just didn't look right to them. And then just a couple days later, the ship winds up, boom, right on Diamond Shoals, all sails set, lifeboats missing, navigation equipment gone. The ship's anchors were gone, and the galley was set for a meal that had never been served. And they actually say that the only living thing on board was the ship's polydactyl cat with 6 toes, which then spawned all of these feral 6-toed cats that are still on Hatteras Island to this day.
Yes, lore, local lore. I love that.
So the ship itself was actually detonated, so it wouldn't provide a hazard to other ships that were coming by. And it went to Ocracoke, and then it was refloated, I believe, in Hurricane Ione in the mid 50s, back over to Hatteras Island. It sat in front of the balanced Texaco station for years and years and years with the capstan in this one section of the ship. And then eventually the capstan and the artifacts made their way over to us. And some of the ship's timbers are actually incorporated in the facade of our gift shop. You can see them. So that's pretty cool.
Like that, right out, like that cool little wood section and all that. That's historic. Yep. That's not a modern.
Mm-hmm. It's actual timbers with the wooden plugs off the Carolee Deering, the schooner Carolee Deering.
That is awesome.
I'm going to straight nerd out on that. Like people are going to be like, "What are you looking at?" Like you don't even know.
It's a crazy story. I mean, it was the time of year that happened at Cape Hatteras Station. It was like it was late January, and it took them from like the 31st of January until the 4th of February to board the ship. And it's pretty crazy. I did a video on it for the centennial this year that's posted to our website. It's also on our Facebook page. And there's a guy named Bland Simpson who wrote a novel about the mystery, and he does a really great kind of opening reading of one of the passages from his book that just really kind of paints a picture. And then the video just progresses into a presentation about the information about the ship. So definitely something to check out.
All right. That's a good way to leave it. Let's leave it open-ended. There's more to discuss always. So what that means is at some point in the future, Josh, we're going to have you back here.
Absolutely.
We'll have some more stories from the Outer Banks. So go ahead and tell our listeners again one more time where they can, find you guys, not just in person, but, on social media where it seems everybody lives nowadays.
Yeah. Well, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum and visit us online at graveyardoftheatlantic.com.
But definitely go down to Hatteras Island and see them. They are the very last building. All you have to do is get on Highway 12, drive south. There's literally only one road on this entire freaking island chain. You cannot get lost. Just get on the road and go south. And when you hit the when you hit the first ferry that you have to get on to go anywhere else, don't get on the ferry. Go to the left and go to the parking lot of the museum. It's right by Ramp 55. For those,
it looks like a big ship on its side.
Yeah. And it can take a punch. It's a ship-looking building that is super well built. So anyway, Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum is a treasure that not a lot of people know about unless they make their way to the island. So we're hoping to use our small voice to help lift your voice. You guys are doing fantastic work down there. So thanks
appreciate
for spending
that
time with us, Josh, and we'll reach out to you soon. So all of our listeners out there, we are in season 3. We are doing this. We decided you're stuck with us. We're going to just, bring you more history stories. We got a lot coming up this year. 2022 is going to be huge for us. We're hoping it's huge for you guys too. I hope you guys are investing in yourselves and doing something fun, but we definitely are doubling down on what we want to bring you guys. So hang out with us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at History Things Podcast. You can at the History Things Podcast. I forgot that the is part of our stuff, whatever. If you guys want to reach out to us via email, you can email us at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. If you've been enjoying the show, if you've been hanging out with us in season 1, man, more power to all of you who've been doing that. But if you've been with us in season 1, we thank you all so very much. And if you've been enjoying the show and looking for ways to help out, please make sure you leave us a review and a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. It really does help. We do thank you all. And if you're just tuning in for the first time, go back and listen to the good stuff you've missed in season 1 and season 2.
And then stick around for the rest of this one.
Stick around, because this is going to be a wild and wonderful year, just like West Virginia. Anyway, this has been the History Things Podcast, sponsored by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Shop trhistorical.com. Use the promo code HistoryThings. Get 10% off your next purchase, and make sure you tell Dave, Matt, and Pat from the History Things Podcast sent you. So, for my co-host, Matt Borders, for our guest tonight, Administrator Josh Nonnemocher from the Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, I am your co-host, Pat McGuire. This has been the History Things Podcast, saying we'll see you all later!
Have a good night!
On Facebook and Instagram at the History Things Podcast for all the latest news and exclusives. Make sure to also follow Pat and Matt on their social medias at History Things with Pat and at Matt Borders Books. Have a question, comment, or compliment for the show? Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show.